I want to start by mentioning that who's sponsoring this event. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. My name is Christopher Wolf, and we just want to say a word about what the APPI is. Basically, it's a group of scholars supported by local businessmen that especially wants to embrace and articulate a natural law public philosophy. It's an idea of moral law based on reason, and we want to try to confront both, especially the key political, social, cultural issues of our society, and to do so in a way that especially represents the central principles of the American founding that are oriented especially toward freedom and prosperity, but also based on a certain kind of cultural integrity as well. And so we sponsor various kind of events. We have kind of a two-pronged series of events. One is speakers and conferences at the University of Dallas, and also other academic activities. We sometimes have national conferences that ultimately result in published books on various topics. We have a book called Liberalism at the Crossroads, one on the family, civil society, and the state, a book on homosexuality in American public life, a book on judicial imperialism, and how to rein that in. So we do a variety of activities in the academic area. Then we also want to provide some activities for businessmen, for professionals in the Dallas area. Originally we were located in Milwaukee, but when I moved to the University of Dallas a little bit over 2 years ago, brought the APPI here, and we're trying to ask ourselves, what can we do in a way for the common good of Dallas as a broad community, and especially, again, think about what we can contribute to discussion of these broad social, political, and cultural issues. So this is our first major event, and we're really delighted to have you all, and I think it's a great turnout here today. The next event, and there are flyers on this at the registration table if you didn't get one coming in, is a talk by Samuel Gregg of the Acton Institute, and he'll be speaking at the Catholic Foundation for a lunchtime presentation on American capitalism, what's right and what's wrong. And that will be on Wednesday, November 2nd. And so I hope we have the chance to see a lot of you on that day. Another practical note is at each of the tables, some of you see, I guess, there's 8 copies of The Vocation of the Business Leader. This is the document that our speaker helped to write, and so please take that home, and I'm sure after listening to Mike, that's going to be a great incentive for you to read the whole document. And then I want to in particular thank the Business Ethics Forum, which is co-sponsoring this event with us, and also the law firm of Ferguson, Braswell and Fraser for providing some financial support for it as well, for which we're very grateful. So I want to turn it over to John Kaisersod for a minute to talk for the Business Ethics Forum.
Good morning. I'm really excited about Dr. Naughton speaking here today because we've been doing for about 10 years a quarterly meeting of business leaders to look at practical business case studies and apply the principles that you're going to hear about today. They come in large part from Catholic social teaching, but they are very practical. In fact, people will often find them surprisingly practical. What does Catholic social teaching have with business, have to do with business? And then when they discuss it and they look into it, they realize, wow, this really is important. Even it really has an influence on the hot topics of today, like employee engagement, self-managed teams, things like that. So the Business Ethics Forum meets quarterly. We have 2 meetings that are identical, but at different locations and times. And we discuss case studies spreading from strategic bankruptcy in real estate to forced ranking of the employee evaluation systems, to work-life balance. There's all kinds of across-the-board different issues. So that I can send it back to Chris, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Mike Naughton is the co-chair of Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. And Mike has had a really long and distinguished career. We met many years ago. He actually drove my oldest daughter to high school back in the dark ages when he was teaching theology at Catholic Memorial High School, when he was still a graduate student at Marquette, where I taught for a number of years. And Mike went on to become one of the real experts on business ethics and has developed a real expertise in that over time. Mike is also the head of the Catholic Studies program at the University of St. Thomas, which is the oldest and largest Catholic Studies program in the world. And it's really been a kind of rock for a lot of students who have gone to the University of St. Thomas, and I've known a good number of students who have come out of that program, and it really is a very fine one. The most interesting thing I think about Mike's background, and there's just so much that could be said, is what leads to today's presentation. You know, a few years ago, Mike was one of a very select group of people who went to the Vatican to discuss this topic of the vocation of the business leader. And based on those discussions, a document was produced by the Vatican, which Mike helped to write, and that's what leads to the presentation today. Mike has so many publications. Some of the books include Respect in Action, Applying Subsidiarity in Business, Leading Wisely in Difficult Times, 3 Cases of Faith and Business, Bringing Your Business to Life, the 4 Virtues that will help you build a better business and a better life, Rediscovering Abundance, Interdisciplinary Essays on Wealth, Income, and Their Distribution in the Catholic Social Tradition, Rethinking the Purpose of Business, Managing as if Faith Mattered, Christian Social Principles in the Modern Organization. So, I mean, all of these obviously are centered on the same kinds of issues. And as John says, in a way the goal here is to provide principles that you can live by, not just abstract theoretical statements, but very practical principles. One other quick note, if in the middle of the talk, Mike has to sit down, it's not because he's protesting anything. It's because he's having an attack of sciatica the last day or two. And so there's a possibility he may have to deliver his talk from a chair rather than standing here. We'll see how things go.
Someone said to me, getting old is not for wussies. But anyhow, listen, it's a really great pleasure to be here. And it's a really great pleasure to be able to talk to you about this document, The Vocation of the Business Leader. What I like to try to do is actually give you kind of an insight about what this document is about. Rather than giving you a summary, I'm actually going to particularly focus on the last section of the document, which is about action. And I'd like to get to that insight. And in order for that to happen, one of the things we want to be mindful is at the heart of this idea of the vocation of the business leader is how you and I understand the work that we do. And once we can get a grasp about how we understand the work that we do, then we can begin to understand about what is the purpose of this institution that we often call business, which is why we talk about this idea of profits with purpose. But first, I'd like to hit this issue about how do we understand our work? Because everyone in this room, sitting in this room, has a view of work. And much of that view of work comes from the stories of our lives. It's not an abstraction. It's very concrete. Now, we may not always make those connections, but the views will often come from the stories. And I suspect that because of where you're at and the positions you're in, you guys have some great stories. But, like all of us, we also have stories that actually cause some problems, that actually trip us up. If I can give one story, I grew up on the south side of Chicago in a blue-collar neighborhood, and both my parents are from Ireland. And I was walking out the door one day at the age of 16, and my father looked at me and he said, Michael, you'd be a good boy, Michael. sure did, whatever, right? Most teenagers say to their father. But before I can take another step, he looks at me and says, Michael, if you can't be good, you be careful. All right, I think I can do that. Well, an unfortunate event happened to me that evening, and my father had to pick me up from the Chicago police station. I'll spare you the details. But he walked into the police station, he looked at me, he said, Michael, I think you better just be good. Now, I say that story not only to talk about my own therapy, about dealing with the problems of my own father, but we often tend to get fixated on being careful. We live in a culture that is quite concerned about being careful. And thus, we have designated drivers, right? Safe and careful drivers who take home drunk and stupid friends. We have this thing that we call safe sex, somehow thinking that non-productive, disease-free sex will make up for its unitive and percolative meaning. We have a view of education that's trying to constantly get the right grades, to get the right scores, to get into the right schools, and we produce a generation of students who've lost the love of learning. And that all of us are often concerned about our own career strategies. What do I have to do to get from here to there to there? And yet we sometimes lost sight of what does it mean to have good work instead of just being careful. So it's this type of distraction, and we are all in it. Whether we're in the university, whether you're in law, whether you're in business, we all get distracted from this deeper question about what is the good that we ought to strive for. So in order for that to occur, we have to ask ourselves some big questions. Because otherwise, we often live a life that often is divided, and we don't even know the divisions occurring. So this morning, and in this document, I want to talk about three big questions. And the first question is, what am I working for? Because you and I work way too many hours to deprive ourselves of a good answer to that question. And we should never just ask that question once, but on a continual basis for the growth of it. But here's the paradox. The paradox is you and I will never get a good answer to that question by only asking that question. We have to ask ourselves another question. And this is an odd question, but it's the question about what am I resting in? Strange question. But here's at the key of it found in the book of Genesis. You and I are not only made to work, you and I are also made to rest. And it's precisely in the connections of these two and the integration of these two that where we can get the third question, what am I living for? Let me kind of put a warning out there. When we talk about our work over here and our rest over here, the goal is not simply just balance, because the balance of those things often foster what we call a divided life. What we want to be thinking about is how do these things get interconnected? And that's a lifelong project. So, these are the three big questions. And there's something about the occupational hazard of academics. If we can't put it into a matrix, we don't think it's important. So the matrix that I'm going to use in this presentation does not describe all of life. If we push on it, we'll fall apart. Right? You are too complex, I'm too complex to be put in boxes. But it's just a pedagogical tool, it's a teaching tool for me, for you to follow where we're going to go this morning. Okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is academics also like a thesis. And here's the thesis. You and I will never get work right. We'll never get business right. We'll never get leadership right unless we get leisure right. Right? So that's the thesis. And you might want to challenge me on that thesis, but that's what I like to do. So what I'd like to do this morning is I'm going to start right down here, and I'm going to give you three versions about how people look at their work, how they look at their leisure, and how they integrate it. And all of these ideas are kind of peppered through this document that we have called the Vocation of the Business Leader. Okay? So, view number one. Some people look at their work as a job. So I mentioned to you I grew up in the south side of Chicago, a blue-collar neighborhood. And if they knew I was here talking to you about business or work as a vocation or calling, they said, Mike, you've been in the ivory tower too long. it's about the money, right? Don't give me this airy-fairy stuff. They were most likely in Minneapolis, by the way, downtown in Minneapolis, there's a diner called Al's Diner. And when you walk into the kitchen, it says, a plaque that says, "There's no fulfillment here." Don't come here to look for fulfillment. This is the wrong place. Go somewhere else, right? I mean, the idea that you think about work as meaningful is ridiculous. Or most likely, I think my friends would quote a fellow Chicagoan who said, listen, work is so great. How come they have to pay us to do it? Come on, let's get real. Now, by the way, this is not just a blue-collar phenomenon. This is increasingly a phenomenon that we see in business, in law, in medicine, even in the academy. Because what you find, particularly in terms of leaders within these institutions, is that they tend to be highly technocratic and bureaucratic. One example of this is found in the slogan that often goes like this: if it can't be measured, it can't be managed. And thus, all that people do is they manage things that they can measure. This is often what happens. Now, by the way, let's be clear. Measurements are important. I'm the board chair of a manufacturing company. Every board meeting we have, we go through measurables. Measurements are really important. But measurements can't exhaust the reality in front of you. Here's the problem with measurements. The more you often measure something, the more you often drive the spirit out of it. There are limits to measurement. They can't explain all of reality. So then the question is, why do people look at their work this way? Now, there are lots of reasons, but this is where I want to come to this point of leisure. And a lot of people look at their leisure as an amusement. We live in a highly entertaining culture. We love to be entertained. We love to pay our entertainers, and this is why they're often the big salary receivers in our culture. And it's interesting, the way we understand our leisure as entertainment is best captured by the singer-songwriter Billy Joel in a song called The Piano Man, where he says, they know it's been me they've been coming to see, to forget about life for a while. So when we move into leisure, it's often a more form of escape. Or if we're to look at it a bit more philosophically, Jacques Rouleau, a French social critic, put it this way. He says, instead of being the moment when we rediscover ourselves thinking about who we ought to be, leisure is the moment when amusements succeed to the maximum in making us forget. By the way, etymologies are amazing here. Look at the word amusement. It comes from the Greek word muses. The muses were the goddesses of the liberal arts that were meant to refresh us, to help us to see a much larger reality. Well, you know when you put the word "God" in front of it, it negates it. If I'm a theist, I believe in God. If I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. Well, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, look up amusement, about definition 4 or 5, it says this: to stare stupidly at something. Now, this is my wife's description of me watching television, right? And that's an interesting phenomenon. Matter of fact, much of our, often our advertising industry has captured this. I was in Chicago a couple of years ago at Midway Airport, and I picked up a US Day Today, and there was a caption for a chain of hotels, and it was this: the weekend getaway. Your body checks in and your mind checks out. We have this with Las Vegas, right? We go to Las Vegas for a weekend, and we all say, whatever happens in Vegas, stays in Vegas. Now, whoever said that should get sued, because the only thing that stays in Vegas is your money. Everything else comes right back with you. That's not the way human activity works. It doesn't stay there. It comes right back with you. But this idea of the weekend as a form of escape has also impacted even the way that we understand our celebrations. The commercialization of Christmas, the trivialization of Easter, the utter decadence of Mardi Gras, St. Patrick's Day, the ghoulishness of Halloween. All of these days, by the way, which are holidays, holy days, days that were meant to refresh us, to give us a larger horizon, have now increasingly become acts of frenetic consumption. So where does that put us? What that often puts us is that when I look at my work as a job, it's simply about money, and then my leisure as a kind of form of amusement, of escape, I often see life as simply a series of gratifications. We give that a name. We call it consumerism, where I'm more concerned about what I have and less concerned about what I become in the having. Pope Francis has been quite keen on this one. He often says that consumerism blunts the conscience. And here's the interesting way that he describes it. Consumerism creates cultural poverty. That's what it creates. We're all against poverty, but there's also a deep cultural poverty that often consumerism creates. So, point number one. On this view, it's very interesting. This issue of amusement is often what people will live for, but there's often a dirty trick that goes along with this, because this costs money, which then causes people to work more, which then causes them to have less time for leisure. So it's an interesting kind of trade-off that often people see it. So that's view number one. And you'll see this peppered through some of the problems in the document when we talk about that. View number two is that some of us look at our work as a career. I suspect many of us in the room see our work as a career. We like our work. We get a lot of self-esteem from our work. There's a lot of gratification. There's a guy who wrote a book called Flow, and he talks about the flow of these talents and capabilities that you and I have. And that flow comes out of us, and it meets these tasks. And we, in a sense, make great advancements on those tasks. And we often feel a great degree of usefulness, of accomplishments. And there's a great degree of satisfaction. That is, you and I are made to work. The Latin language, homo faber, man the maker. This is why we like to work. But the challenge of the career is often how they view the work. And interesting, again, etymologies. The word career comes from the French word carrière, which is the same word we get the word car from. And thus we often look at our work as a career, as an automobile, a self-driven vehicle that we decide individually, personally, what is satisfying and what's not satisfying. And thus we lose sight of the social or kind of spiritual reason for this. And so the leader, as a careerist, is often not money mad, but they are goal-oriented, right? This is often how the leaders, they want to accomplish things, but often for their own satisfaction, not for anything larger. So again, why do people see their work as a career? Lots of reasons, but much of it has to do with how we understand leisure, but not as an amusement, but leisure as utility. Let me give you two examples of this. Education. Education in our culture is increasingly justified based on its instrumental value to career. So my students will come to me and say, like Dr. Naughton, like why do I gotta take theology? Like, what is it gonna do for my career? Now I try to explain to them that actually the word leisure comes from a Latin word called scola, which is where we get the word school. And school is a form of leisure. And they look at me and they say, no. Didn't work, Dr. Naughton. Sorry. Talk to you later, right? But that's why the Greeks and the Romans and the Christians had the whole understanding of what liberal education was about. It was a form of leisure. You looked at mathematics and you looked at history and music and art and business and philosophy and theology to see a much larger reality. So that's education. But the second issue, I think, is even more problematic. It's actually how we look at the word rest itself. Rest is justified to sharpen the saw in order to be more productive. Many of you remember that book by Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective. Very good book, by the way. A lot of great insights. But the last habit is to sharpen the saw. And I don't think he got it quite right. Let me explain why. There's a psychologist, Hungarian psychologist called Sándor Ferenczi. And he's the one that coined the term Sunday neurotic. Sunday neurosis. And what he came to understand is he often would see these people who had a kind of low-grade dis-ease, a kind of angst, a kind of boredom, a sense of depression, or melancholy. It tended to happen when? It tended to happen on Sundays. And he was puzzled by this. Why Sunday? Now the obvious answer, right? People have to go back to work on Monday. And he kind of penetrated and thought through this, but he actually came to a different conclusion. He said, actually, no, it's not Monday that's the problem. It's actually Sunday's the problem. Because these are people who are trying to rest, they don't know how to rest, and they put themselves in knots. That is, there are some things that we have to do for the right reason. And if we don't do it for the right reason, we often tend to corrupt it. So what does that tell us? What that tells us is that when we look at our work as a career, and if we look at our leisure as a kind of utility to that career, and everything is only understood in terms of work, we often identify ourselves in terms of our achievements. And thus, we fall into this problem of careerism. That we're more concerned about what we've achieved, and less concerned about what we've become in the achieving. Right? We often excuse all sorts of behaviors of certain people by what they've achieved. You all remember Jack Welch, right? Main line, and I hate to do this to Jack Welch, but people would often say, he's a real asshole, but look what he did, right? I mean, we can often fall into that type of habit. Let me give you another case study. You remember Lee Iacocca. I suspect most of you, in terms of the ages that we have, this great American icon of American industry. Well, when he retired from Chrysler Corporation, he was on the front cover of the Fortune magazine with this caption, "How I Flunked Retirement." And he says that his 3 years in retirement have been more stressful than his 47 years in the auto industry. Anybody in the auto industry, it's almost hard to fathom someone saying that. Right? But here's a man who seemed to know who he was as the CEO of the Chrysler Corporation, but was somewhat at sea, spiritually lost outside of that. An economic giant on one hand, and yet a spiritual midget on another. Now one can only admire someone like Lee Iacocca, that the fact that he had the guts to actually be that honest about it in such a public way. So where does that put us? Where that puts us is that we look at these two views of work, and the document talks about this, is that we have a serious cultural problem about how we look at our work, how we look at our leisure, and how we put it together. It could be summarized maybe in this way. When we look at our work as a job, we are simply underinvested in the work that we're doing. We're expecting too little out of the work that we're doing. When we look at our work as a career, we are actually expecting too much out of the work that we do. So then the question is, how does one begin to understand what this work is about? And that's really what the document's about. It's an attempt to describe work and business as a vocation. And I would say this is really where one, from the Catholic perspective, and we talked about this in the committee when we were writing the document, we actually, in a sense, drew a lot from Protestants. Because Lutheran on there, they had a deeper sense of the question of the laity, the vocation. Because they have other problems, but that they were able to maintain. This is where the Catholic Church has to learn from other traditions. But this idea of vocation, again, the Latin word for vocation, vocare, to call. And particularly in the Catholic tradition, we speak about 3 different calls. The first call, the first vocation, is the call to be human. Everyone is called, because everyone is created. Everyone is called to give of themselves. In a document in the Catholic tradition, Gaudium et Spes, says a person cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. This is just one of the universals that no matter where you go, we are always at our best, not when we're taking, not when we're scheming, not when we're calculating. You and I are always at our best when we're giving ourselves in terms of the people that we want to engage with. In the Catholic tradition, we often talk about the idea that there's also this other call to a state of life. And we talk about 3 states, priestly, religious, and lay. Most people are called to lay state, and many of us who are in that lay state are called to marriage, which is why marriage plays such a crucial role to our vocation. A colleague of mine once put it in a very, very clear way. He said to me, he says, my wife only has one husband, my children only have one father. My students have a lot of teachers. I cannot sacrifice that vocation to the vocation of work. But with that said, we are still nonetheless called to work. And in the document, the Vocation of Businesses, it says, a business joins people's gifts, talents, energies, and skills to serve the needs of others. This in turn supports the development of the people who do the work. That is, at the heart of the vocation of the business leader, of anybody, is that we work, and our work is a form of giving. We have these gifts and capabilities that we can give to others. Before going into the Christian tradition, let me just highlight another tradition, the Native American tradition, that actually gets at this in a very interesting way. You remember when the Puritans came to this country, they met the Indians, and they exchanged gifts. And when they went away from each other and they came back, the Native Americans noticed that the Puritans still had the gifts they gave them. And they asked for them back, which is where we get the term Indian giver. Now, what we all can tend to do is we misunderstand cultural situations. And we saw the Native Americans as stingy, greedy, not keeping promises, all those types of things. But we lost sight of the deeper reality. What was ingrained in the Native American tradition is that gifts are meant to be in motion. Your gifts are not for you. Your gifts are to go through you. Right? They're to go through you to other people. And then they come back on you. But if I use my gifts only for myself, they corrupt me. It's called the law of the gift. My gifts can only fulfill me when they go through me to serve other people. And then they come back and they shower upon us the kind of graces of what it means to be a good person. That's a deep understanding of that tradition. But in Christianity, we often talk about this idea of these gifts, and particularly as it relates to the institution of business, in terms of the goods that a business does. And in the document, we talk about three goods, good goods, creating good service that truly serve, good work, fostering the dignity of work by helping coworkers develop their gifts and talents, and good wealth, creating sustainable wealth so it can be distributed justly. Let me make something very clear. Business is not about one good. Profit is a good, but it's only one. Business is about three goods. It's like marriage. Marriage is not simply about one good, increasingly simply sentimentality, but it's also about its unitive and procreative dimensions. A university is not simply about credentialing careers, but they have others. What we've done is we've taken these noble institutions and we've tended to flatten them to simply one crass good. So this document is an attempt to get at those goods. But again, it's related to how we view our work. Let me highlight a problem. And particularly, I would say, my problem. I go to work every day. I get up early. I work really hard. And then all of a sudden, something starts to talk in my head. And I start to say, well, why do I work harder than all these other people? Or why don't they do the things that they should be doing? And why am I always feeling like I'm getting the short end of the stick? And I often say, why do I work 60% and my wife only works 40%? By the way, I never say that to my wife, I just think it. Right? Most of us, we know that, right? You don't do that, right? And then this kind of victimization often leads to a kind of resentment. And then the resentment starts leading to a cynicism. It's all very subtle. It's never very clear. But it's just kind of a gradual type of thing. I raise it because what we often, let me put it in terms of a Latin aphorism. It goes like this: Nemo non quod non habet. You cannot give what you do not have. And if all we do is work, we'll simply exhaust ourselves. It often takes a while, but often negative things start to occur, which is why the idea of leisure is so crucial. And not leisure as an amusement, not leisure as a utility, but at the deepest element is this idea of leisure as contemplation. In the document, we say this, it says this, that leisure is an act of receivement. The first act of the Christian business leader, as of all Christians, is to receive, more specifically, to receive what God has done for him or her. I would say this is one of the most difficult things, particularly for business people to do. We are actors, we are givers, we are doers, but we have a very hard time receiving. Pope Benedict once put it this way. He said, one of the most profound moments of a person's life often tends to be not what they've achieved, but what they have received. Let me highlight maybe 3 of those actions, or 3 habits of this leisure. And the one is this idea of the habit of solitude, the habit of silence. And not just silence out there, but silence in here. I don't know about you, but I got all these things going on in my head all the time, being the unappreciated genius that I am. By the way, I walk to school, it's about 2 miles away from my home, and I have all these debates with my colleagues in my head. I win every debate, by the way. Never lost a debate, right? Now, some of those debates are okay, but what they do is they don't allow me to receive, because the head's too full. When do I shut the tape off? Or that beautiful line from Jesus when he says, "Come to me, all you who labor and find life burdensome." And boy, do I find the university a burdensome place sometimes, right? And I will give you rest. Not me, right? But God will give you rest. It's that idea that that's where the rest begins to occur. I would even say a more difficult habit is the habit of celebration. And a weekly Sabbath, the Lord's Day. This is, I think, we need to look to the Jews, because it's often the Jews who've done a much better job on this than we Christians. Here's maybe a test for you. Can you become a techno-Sabbatarian? Now, some of you, this may be difficult in terms of the work that you have, but can you shut the phone off and give it a rest? Try it for an hour, see what happens. If you can do it for an hour, try it for a morning. And see what happens. We have to give our consumption, our production, and even our technology a rest. Because here, let me advance my thesis of that. I said, if we don't get leisure right, we won't get work right. If we do not get Sunday right, we'll never get Monday right. Right? And I think we need to, in a sense, recover the Lord's Day. And there are many people doing this in very profound ways. And thirdly, the habit of service. Going to the margins. And here we have, particularly as Christians, we have to be connected to the poor. We can't get out of it. And this is not so much that we go to the poor and do things for them, but we need to be connected to the poor to be with them. And they will give us things that no one else can give. So these 3 habits, maybe let me see if a story might flesh it. I met Mother Teresa twice in my life. Once in Chicago and once in India. And I was giving a talk at the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta. And my host, who was Hindu, knew I was Catholic, and he says, "You want to go meet Mother Teresa?" I said, "Sure." So we got into a cab, went down to the Mother House, we walk in, and there's Mother Teresa. 1995, 2 years before she died. And my Hindu friend drops to his knees, and he's trying to kiss Mother Teresa's feet. And Mother Teresa's trying to pick him up. And he's trying to kiss him. And there's this wrestling match going on. And honest to goodness, the only thought that came to my head in this kind of extraordinary scene was, man, she has big feet. And God, is she short. And boy, is she old. And aren't you, what is going on with you? I mean, you got the icon of holiness in front of you, and all I can think about were feet. Well, we had about a 20-minute conversation. It was delightful. She talked about her work. She was trying to get into China. The Chinese government was giving her lots of trouble about that, and she told us about that. We told her about our work at the university. And as we were leaving, she looks at us with kind of a smirk on her face, and she says, "I want to give you my business card," as we're walking out the door. And there was no address, and there was no telephone number or anything of that sort. But it was only this. And she, by the way, she signed it. And I got that business card still sitting on my desk today. And this is what was on the business card. The fruit of silence is prayer. The fruit of prayer is faith. The fruit of faith is love. The fruit of love is service. And the fruit of service is peace. Now you and I, we sometimes think of Mother Teresa as a nice little hallowed saint who did some nice things. Mother Teresa had operations over 90 countries, and she traveled to all of them. She was a very busy woman. But she started her day not with what she wanted, not with what her agenda was, but she started her day, in one sense, with a blank slate. What do you want of me on this day? And that then gave her the capacity to love and serve and be faithful in ways that simply would never have been possible without this capacity of receptivity. So with that said, what does that tell us? If we see our work as a vocation and our leisure as contemplation, we then have the ingredients to this word that we call integrity. Again, the word integrity comes from this word integritas, integer, a whole number, to become whole. And as leaders, what it does is it helps us to be what we might call contemplative practitioners. The one secular author that I think does this well is Jim Collins. And many of you may have read his article in the Harvard Business Review called Fifth Level Leader. And he talked about two major qualities of a great leader. Those who have great resolve. By the way, don't interpret my talk about leisure as let's take it easy. There's no way we can take it easy in this culture. It's not about stopping and smelling roses. You have to have great resolve, and no matter what you do, great creativity, great ingenuity, diligence, perseverance. And he says, that's what's needed for great leaders today. But then he says, but that doesn't make a great leader. And then he talks about humility. But it's interesting, where does humility come from for Jim Collins? It doesn't come from business. It comes from faith, it comes from families, it comes from people accepting sicknesses, cancer, it comes from all these ordeals. He doesn't use the word leisure, but in one sense, Collins gets at a deep insight that humility, that capacity to receive is critical to great leadership. So, let me conclude. I have a full matrix. So, right, if we push at this, it'll fall apart. Right? So let's be clear. Because the fact is we're all over the place. You know, if we took away the lines, we'd be fine. Some of us might look at our work as a job, but we actually have a lot of contemplation. And some of us may look at our work as a vocation, but we spend most of our time in amusement. That just indicates our own divisions. So that's point number one. Point number two, I want to be very clear. There's nothing wrong with work as a job. I work for money. I've gone into my academic vice president, I've gotten 2 raises in my time at St. Thomas. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with wanting to live better. And there's also nothing wrong with a career. When someone says to you, you're doing great work, we're going to give you more responsibility with a different title because we have great confidence. That feels great to climb that ladder and to have that affirmation. But here's the issue. That's not big enough. Augustine, an old saint back in the early church, in a book called The Confessions, says the following. He says, the house of my soul is too small for you to come into it. May it be enlarged by you. That is, we walk around with small visions of work. And it's hard for God to come into those small visions. He wants us to have a bigger vision. And the same thing is true for leisure. Nothing wrong with amusements, nothing wrong with even the utility, but we need a larger vision. And lastly, the word integrity, right? A word that's often bandied around quite a bit, particularly in businesses. But I would say that sometimes we haven't quite recognized the seriousness of the problem. Often people will claim integrity when they say, I have integrity. They're often just before the great fall that will occur. Right? We don't get integrity. We often by ourselves just screw it up. That's why we have to have this capacity to receive. And thus I am never fully responsible. I am partly responsible for my integrity, but I have to receive it from something else. And so I never simply just acquire it. I have to receive it. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much. So Chris.
Let me ask you to flesh out this idea of contemplation a bit more. I mean, some people kind of think of contemplation as kind of a zoning out or something like that, or even worse, boring, and just sitting there thinking. You know, what is this contemplation, practically speaking?
Sure. It's great. For those of you who might have a more philosophical orientation, the vocation of the business leader is part of a much larger tradition, of the Christian tradition. And one person who was very influential in this work was a philosopher, a German philosopher by the name of Joseph Pieper. And he wrote a book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. And when he talks about contemplation, he's at the heart of the contemplative spirit. We often think of it on a personal basis, but he talks about it in terms of worship. He talks about how do you celebrate. Celebrations are forms of contemplation. Think about a wedding. That's a form of contemplation. And it's a form of communal celebrations. So there are what we might call communal forms of contemplation that we often would see in terms of services, church, the Lord's Day, things of that sort, weddings, funerals, right? All those types of things are forms of celebration. That's how we celebrations are communal forms of contemplation. And then there's also personal forms of contemplation. And you need both. You need both. Because today we live in a world that often, as Chris was getting at, we often see contemplation purely on a personal basis. And so people will say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. Which is often a code that says, I don't have to be beholden to anything. I get to make it up my own. Because I get to decide, and no one else does. And it becomes highly therapeutic, and by the way, it gets exhausted very quickly. It doesn't get passed on. And data is starting to show that when people start speaking that way, right? And yet, on the other hand, we see a lot of religious people, certainly in the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, who go to all these celebrations, but it's rote. They're just going through the motions because there's no personal kind of reality that informs it. So those are the two ditches, and that would be one way, I think, of thinking of the idea of contemplation. John?
The distinction of having, doing, and being draws to mind the John Paul II's description of the subjective and objective dimensions of the work, and working is becoming. And I thought it'd be interesting if you could elaborate a little bit on those points.
I gotta tell you, I did that last night. I had to keep this short, and I had that in the talk, so I'm really glad you asked this. John asked, and this is in the document, one of the key insights of the Christian tradition on work is what we call the subjective dimension of work. Think about it this way. You and I today, and particularly you, will be going out into your work and you got to change things, right? And if you don't change things, you'll get fired. And you should get fired. Because part of your work is to change things. And you'll get rewarded on it, you'll get evaluated on it, right? And depending on where you're at, it can be pretty expensive. But here's the thing. When you work out there, this what we call the objective changes, you are simultaneously changing things in here. And no one's going to reward you on that. No one often will even evaluate it on it. But the changes are occurring probably with greater profundity in here. And the question is, are those changes positive or are those changes negative? And that's why all work has dignity. At my university, I should know the name of the janitor who cleans my toilet because they have as much dignity as the president of my university. All work has dignity. We are not Greeks. By the way, the Greeks often saw work in the sense that they gave the manual labor to the slaves. But the Jews saw great dignity in physical labor. And Christians have adopted that Jewish vision of it. Right? So all work, precisely because it has a subjective dimension. It's changing them. We don't evaluate work only on its objective criteria. We also evaluate work on its subjective change. That would be one way of thinking about it. Thank you. Please.
So in the same way that Chris asked about contemplation, I want to talk about integrity. So integrity kind of has a definition of being and kind of an awareness of who you are, right, and how you act. But when you talk about this in terms of integration, right, how is it influencing these other actions and these other states of being?
Right. Well, I think, do you mean on all of the?
Well, vocation and contemplation.
Right. We often say about integrity, and people often say I have integrity because I do what I say. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you will have. Integrity is trying to get to the deeper being of who you've been created to be. Right? That's why it's trying to connect it to these deeper structures of vocation is the sense of what am I called to? What are the gifts that God has given me? Because he's given me certain gifts. One of the challenges we often have, and I fall into this all the time, I grew up in the south side of Chicago. I have no idea how I got into the academy. I still feel like a fish out of water being in the academy. And I often look at these people like Chris Wolf and others who have really high IQs. They're really bright men. I say, gosh, I wish I was smart as they were. Right? And so I do all this wishing about all the other gifts that I want. But I then have to say, no, wait, God has given me gifts. What gifts has he given me? And I got to use those gifts in this particular work that I'm doing. So it's getting at the way that I'm made, right? And not just the way that I think I am. So, and the same thing with the leisure question. So the integrity question is trying to get to the deeper structure to it, rather than this kind of superficial level. I do what I say. Well, you may not be saying the right thing. And if you're not saying the right thing, you are not getting at the deeper realms of this integrity. This is why it is a lifelong project. And every level that we get to, we start to see other gaps, right? And in fact, we should also be almost hesitant about saying that we have integrity, right? Because God's wanting more of us, much more to us. Because often when we say of integrity, we say, I'm satisfied, I'm fine, I don't need to change. And yet all of us in those kind of honest moments have to recognize that. So, and I think it's a word that we need to recover. I think it's a word that actually has been cheapened, but it's a word worthy of being recovered. So, thanks for the question. Sir.
What you've talked about today, and I think just this vocation of the business leader is not discussed very much at all. Even coming from a Catholic university, you just don't hear about it a lot. So what do you think is at stake dependent upon getting this right for the individual, but also the nation?
Yeah. I think there's a lot at stake. Maybe let me give you another metaphor. I think we're living in a culture of cut flowers versus a culture of a tree with roots. And I think there's a lot of talk, you see this in business schools, whether Catholic universities, Protestant universities, secular universities. We talk about business ethics, we talk about corporate social responsibility, we talk about sustainability, we talk about transparency, and all those are good things. There's a lot of good things about it. But there's often no root system to it. They look pretty, they sound fine, but they often they often become fads. And I think eventually people start to see the fads. And so then the question is, what gives it roots? And I think we live in a highly technological culture. And technology is a wonderful thing. It gives us abilities to do things we couldn't have done 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? But the problem is that our technology, our strengths are always our weaknesses. And often what technology does, it undermines the deeper human reality. Notion of virtue, the notion of the common good, the notion of vocation. These are things that for over 3,000 years we've been talking about these terms. And it gives us a deep root structure, particularly within a kind of Western world, which has been critical to the globalization that we've been finding ourselves in, that has the capacity to make those things more human rather than simply falling into commodity, which leads to simply transactions that turns people into simply cogs. So I think there's tremendous at stake. Now, how do we do this in a pluralistic world that we live in? If you would go into your law firm today or your business today, and you say, we're going to talk about vocation, it may not work, right? But we might have to talk about other ways. So we can find other ways. Chris Wolf has done a lot of work on the natural law. In the Catholic tradition, we talk about two kind of elements here, right? We talk about the importance of revelation of Scripture, which I think gives us the deep root structure. But sometimes when we have to talk about this within a pluralistic world, we have to find different language that can connect to people that will give them that deeper meaning. And again, I think universities should be doing that a lot more than what they are. So I think that's, we actually are more of the problem than the solution when it comes to these things. Thank you. So what if please, yes.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that. The idea of cut flowers versus a tree with deeper roots, and going back to the beginning of your talk, when you were talking about measurements, or more than measurements, how is it that we can help change society so that we're not focused on the short-term measurements that create the cut flowers?
Right.
And
That's a great question, and for some people it'll be easier than others. If you're in an institution and where you have incentives that are constantly pressuring you into those short-term realities, doesn't mean you give up, but it just gets a lot harder. But if you're in an institution that has a deep moral purpose to it, and you could be in a publicly traded company, or you can be in a family business. All sorts of different companies have a deep sense of purpose. There, I think it becomes easier because at least you have the conditions to make that happen. So it depends a lot in terms of where you're at, and the challenges will be different in where you're at. But I do think this is why, particularly in the Catholic tradition, we have tended to relegate the idea of vocation to the religious. And that has been one of the downsides of the Catholic tradition, that one of its blind spots. What we have to recognize, business particularly, is an increasingly very important institution. I mean, think about the rise of the modern corporation. It is an extraordinary story, right? What has happened to the corporation, and the massive size of it, and the massive influence of it. What kind of leaders do we want running those institutions? It's just like, whether it's a police department, or whether it's government, or whether it's university, you want people who are not just fixated on short, as you say, fixated on limited goals, but I want a leader who can see things whole, who can see how things are related to each other. Because all of us know, right, there are so many unintended consequences of what we're doing today that we don't know what's going into the future. And what do you want? You want a leader who has foresight, and that's what we call practical wisdom, who can be wise in practical affairs, and who can see the larger part of it. I do think, and I haven't done an extensive survey on Jim Collins' work, Good to Great, but I think he was getting at leaders who were never just simply in the short term, but he was recognizing this large thing. And they weren't the flashy guys, and they were mostly guys in that area, but they could see that. So, and again, but certain institutions will make that harder than others depending on how they're set up. So thank you for the question. So let me wrap this up with one more slide. I did have a slide here. I wasn't quite sure where we're going about just we could kind of examine this on a personal and organizational level, but I think we've done that with some of the questions that you have. And by the way, if any of you want these slides, they're yours. I stole all this from other people, so I don't mind you stealing anything from me. It's what we call a common good, a good that's shared in common. Because these ideas are part of the inheritance of what we've received from the beauty of this tradition of Christianity. This is not one individual. And similar to your point, this is a tradition that needs to be shared, but we have to find creative ways in which to share it. But I want to end with a quote from a man named John Henry Newman. I've been part of, Chris mentioned the center that we have at our university called the Center for Catholic Studies. And Newman was a major figure that helped us think through things at the university about how we were going to establish the center. And one of the things that Newman, I love the phrase that he used, he says, how do we see things in relationship to each other? Because we tend to get fixated on parts, right? And the key thing is, how do we see things in relation? And what Newman has always attempted to do, he attempts to kind of keep bringing things up to a larger reality. And I want to end with this quote because I think he captures the grand narrative of what our vocation is about. It puts our individual personal vocation into this much larger narrative. He put it this way, he says, God created me to do him some definite service. He has committed some work to me which he has not committed to another. I have my mission. I never may know it fully in this life, but I shall be told it in the next. Somehow I am necessary to his purposes. I am a link in a chain, a bond of connection between persons. He has not created me for naught. That is, each of us in this room is called to a definite service. And God calls us by name. He calls me, he calls you. And it's difficult to know exactly what that is, but he's also calling us to be connected to others. That's part of the vocation. That's precisely why a group like this, coming together, thinking through these things together, can be such a helpful thing for today's culture. So thanks for being here and thanks for taking the time. Thank you.